Hi, I'm Ozzie Ostwalt. Welcome to Religion and Life. This week we take a look at the historic civil rights movement in the United States and consider the role religion played with some of its leaders. We'll also explore the ongoing struggle for civil rights and discuss if religion continues to exert a strong influence today. My guest is Dr. Jesse Taylor of Appalachian State's Department of Philosophy and Religion. Welcome, Jesse. Appreciate you coming on today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Sure. Well, we just celebrated Martin Luther King Day, and I thought it would be a good time to reflect a bit on the civil rights movement in this country and to talk a little bit about the role religion may have played in at least some aspects of the movement. And Martin Luther King's life is probably a good place to start. Maybe you could talk to us just a little bit about Martin Luther King Jr. We know he was a Baptist minister and that religion played a role in his personal life, but it also spilled over into the movement as well. Is that correct?
That is correct. As most of us know, Dr. King was a towering figure not just in the black community, but in the country. His work started in the black community. I think when I think about what the mission of the church is, for example, that is perhaps primarily for salvation for its membership, and also it addresses identity issues. And in that respect, I think conditions of life come into play. And clearly, I think as a tradition, in the tradition of the black church, it has always been a focus, because of circumstantial necessity, to focus on, to take a look at conditions of life for its black membership. And that sort of theme, I think, led Dr. King to sort of facilitated Dr. King's rise to prominence and sort of oriented the focus that he subsequently took in civil rights as seeing blacks as children of God, and also seeing the sort of unfortunate experiences that blacks were suffering at the hands of whites. I think he saw that as a kind of a call for him to correct that sort of injustice as much as he could.
And I think you mentioned him responding out of his religion and out of his faith commitment, and he was a trained theologian. He had a doctorate in theology. And he also used the church, though, as a kind of base for community organizing, if you will. I think from the Montgomery bus boycotts to the organization of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, it seems to me that the black church was kind of his focus and center for at least the portion of the movement that he led.
Yes. And I think that's in keeping with the tradition of the black church, generally speaking. The black church has been, for the most part, the center of black intellectualism. So leaders were, for the most part, they had a church background. And certainly Dr. King used the church and the resources, the intellectual resources accessible to him there to organize movements and to execute the civil rights mission.
Sure. Now, the particular, let's say, phase of the movement that he was known for leading took on a philosophy of nonviolence. I think some of that perhaps was out of his own theological background, but could you talk a little bit about the particular strategy of nonviolence and how that played itself out in Dr. King's movements within the black church and then beyond as well?
I think that was a two-prong, sort of. And I like the fact that you use the word strategy, because I think nonviolence for Dr. King was, it had a large strategic component to it. He didn't believe that that black liberation could be successful with violence. So nonviolence he saw as the only vehicle. Plus, he felt that that an appeal to white consciousness. And, I would say as well that one of the sort of technological innovations, and this is going to show my age a little bit, but you know, the 50s, early 60s, television had come around in the late 50s. Well, earlier than that, but in most black homes had them by the late 50s, early 60s. And so they were throughout the nation, and he could sort of bring some of the abuses of blacks to the consciousness of the masses of the country. And I think to be violent in that sort of scenario would project a kind of animalistic image onto black persons. So he thought that it's better to suffer abuse than to impose it. So I think that was the strategic part of it, or at least part of the strategy for nonviolence. And then, on the other hand, he was a strong advocate. He was a highly spiritual person. He did believe in love, and he was trying to promote character, and he didn't think not just character of blacks, but character of whites as well, that were disposed to impose injustices on blacks. So I think he saw nonviolence as something that he really believed in, and he thought would make us all better in the final analysis. So that was his approach along those lines. So it was strategic in the sense that he didn't think any alternative would result in anything successful. And it was also spiritual in the sense that he believed in nonviolence. And this is, I think it comes from his reading of Mahatma Gandhi on nonviolence. And he thought that was a vehicle that could lead us to the promised land that he often spoke of.
Right, right. So there's the strategic element reinforced by Gandhi's example, but then also the spiritual and moral imperative, I guess, that he would use to love one's enemies or to turn the other cheek, which is sometimes biblical allusions that have been cited for being at the heart of some of his nonviolent philosophy.
Yes.
Yeah. Use the phrase promised land there that Dr. King would sometimes refer to. I have a short clip here, a video from one of his speeches I'd like to take a look at, and maybe you can comment on. This particular speech is sometimes called the mountaintop speech. It was delivered the night before he was assassinated, and he uses that phrase, the promised land, in that speech. So let's watch this short clip, and then maybe we can talk about it.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
It's a very stirring excerpt from that speech. I've got some things I'd like to say, but I'll give you first crack at it there.
It conjures up some memories that still resonate with me. I remember well watching that speech on television, and I think he was there in Memphis for the sanitation workers and their strike. There was strong opposition to to his coming to Memphis at that time, as I recall. But he gave a very eloquent speech, and it was good to watch.
Yeah, well, the things that are relevant to our topic here is that such allusions he makes to the mountaintop and the Promised Land. Of course, these are Old Testament Mosaic allusions that he peppered into his speech. His admonition that he wanted to do God's will. And just the rhetorical eloquence that he always had, but I think is particularly evident here, demonstrates some of the cadences and the rhythms and the styles that one would associate with a black preaching style and his own background. So I think it's a particularly nice excerpt to watch for this. But and it's quite prophetic, I guess, that speaking of longevity and fear or lack of fear, and then we know what happened the next day.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, thanks for sharing that with me. I'd like for you to maybe just, before we leave King, comment on, I guess, one of his most anthologized works, perhaps, Letter from a Birmingham Jail. I think it was there that he outlined his case for nonviolence, but he also said that there was that people have a moral responsibility to break unjust laws or to stand against injustice if it's in the legal system. Do you have a comment on that, or an example of how that worked itself through the civil rights movement or Dr. King's philosophy at all?
Yeah. Civil disobedience, he thought, was a requirement of the movement because the laws were the laws enacted for blacks denied what he thought were human rights. Mm-hmm. And so he appealed to a higher law, which, of course, he talked about as God's law. And God's law could not be usurped by human law, he felt. And so he felt justified in civil disobedience. Mm-hmm. And one of the interesting things about that, he was prepared to, always prepared to accept the consequences, as evidenced by the numerous times that he went to jail for the protest and stuff that he initiated and participated in. I just want to go back, if I may, and comment a little bit on this notion of the Promised Land, just from the clip that we just saw. Mm-hmm. The idea of the Promised Land, when I think about that, I can't help but think of it in metaphorical terms. It seems to me to be a metaphor for a better place on earth. Mm-hmm. I think if you think back to his I Have a Dream speech, the one he gave in D.C. in '63, it was all about that day when little black boys and little white girls would hold hands and, mm-hmm. and sing out the days of old, the Negro spiritual, free at last. So I think for him, there's a sense in which, of course, there is the Promised Land of heaven, but there's also the Promised Land here on earth, and he was trying to create a just world where people could coexist. And I think to some extent, the idea of the Promised Land is a metaphor for a more just earthly existence. Yeah.
So the idea of the Promised Land was an existential idea, yes. An existential metaphor, not just a sweet by and by in heaven, but rather there was this idealism that there could be social justice on this earth in this time. And that's what he was working toward, it seems to me. Yeah. One of his, I don't know if you call it theological mentors or spiritual mentors, was Walter Rauschenbusch. I know he read his theology when he was in grad school, and Rauschenbusch was known for the social gospel movement, and that expressed a similar idea without the civil rights component to it, but the idea that there could be established on earth a promised land or a kingdom of God even, where social justice reigned and where there weren't the inequalities. So that's, in your mind, that's the sort of world that he was not only working for, but that Dr. King referenced in his speech, that someday would be achievable.
Yes, yes. I think, one of the things that King inherited and was spearheaded by the Montgomery bus boycott in, what was that, 55 or 53? Started in 53 maybe and ended in 55. Mm-hmm. Anyway, he saw the black community in a tremendous slumber. The drudgery of a long history of racial oppression had, the abolitionist Martin Delany had once talked about a second nature. Mm-hmm. And I think part of what King took on as his mission was to awaken the black community from its slumber of years past, to remind the black community that they had every right to engage their full humanity, and indeed an obligation to do so. And I think that sort of triggered a kind of inspiration amongst the population. We listened to him. Mm-hmm. We took him very, very seriously. He was, as the world knows now, he was eloquent. And I think maybe that eloquence is a composite of his sort of educational background. He was an undergraduate at Morehouse, of course, and then he mm-hmm. went on to Boston U for his doctorate. There may have been an institution in between, I don't recall. Mm-hmm. But in any event, he had seen all sides of the life of black, and then being from Atlanta, a southern city, which was at that time still highly segregated, he took it upon himself to initiate a movement to remind black people that indeed their lives belong to them. And I remember, and I don't recall which speech he made the remark, but in one of his speeches he talked about a person not being able to ride your back unless it's bent in the first place, which was really a call to black people mm-hmm. To become perpendicular with respect to their dignity, with respect to their place in the world, in all of that.
Do you think there was a moment in which that slumber was broken? Would it have been 1963 when he gave his speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, or earlier perhaps, or was it a gradual evolution or a gradual awakening during his work?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think in 1963, when there was a march on Washington, yeah, that was a historical moment. Mm-hmm. I don't remember the count, but certainly it was the largest group of people that had ever assembled at the Washington Memorial for that sort of thing. And it reverberated, not just in the black community, but it sort of hit the nerve of masses of people of all stripes. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that was a pivotal moment for him. But at the same time, there was an undercurrent of because of television and because northern blacks, northern urban blacks, particularly youth, had seen the dog bites, had seen the water hoses, had seen the police batons, had seen just the brutal beatings, were adopting an attitude of, I'm not going to take it. Right. And then there was, Malcolm X, who was inspiring mm-hmm. those kinds of sentiments, which I think created a little bit of an opposition to the the successes that King was realizing.
I'm glad you mentioned Malcolm X. So maybe let's shift the focus a little bit. We oftentimes talk about the civil rights movement as if it were a unified movement in a particular historical era. We know that it's still ongoing in many ways. And we also know that there were many different facets of the movement even in the 60s. So there was King's movement. There was also Malcolm X, who had a very different type of, I guess, religious experience, religious background, converting to Islam, I believe, while he was in prison. So how would you differentiate, or how would you differentiate between the movement as perceived by Dr. King and the movement as led by Malcolm X? How were their goals different? How were their strategies different, and whatnot?
This is a topic or an issue that I've given some consideration to in my life. I think from Malcolm X's perspective, and when we identify Malcolm X as espousing the Islamic religion, it was the brand of Islam that was taught by Elijah Muhammad, whose center of operations were in Chicago at the time. And Elijah Muhammad was a strong advocate of black self-help. In fact, the Nation of Islam in Chicago employed a number of as many blacks as they could afford to bring on the books, and gave them jobs that paid a living wage, that sort of thing, because there was a strong commitment to self-help. And so Malcolm X came out of that, and he also felt that it was the responsibility of blacks to protect their dignity. And he didn't feel that nonviolence, especially when it involved police brutalities, municipal brutalities, public brutalities, all kinds of brutalities, he didn't feel as if it was the right thing to do, to be passive with respect to it, because he felt that it showed a lack of self-respect, a lack of dignity. So he felt that when those kinds of abuses happen, the only appropriate response to them was retaliation. I think, by contrast, King's sentiment was, you're right, Malcolm X, but it just won't work.
That's right. Back to this seeing nonviolence as a strategy
right.
that we talked about earlier. Right. Yeah.
It just won't work, because he felt that blacks would be severely harmed, and we would be portrayed by the media pretty much as thugs, renegades, animals, which is what the sort of caricature that the media had painted of blacks anyway. So he didn't want to reinforce those kinds of stereotypes. Plus, he felt that the appeal to conscience, the appeal to white conscience for the most part, was having some effect. And that Lyndon Johnson, where Malcolm X had absolutely no confidence in the policies of Lyndon Johnson. In fact, he often referred to him as one of the good old boys, the Dixiecrats,
Right.
and didn't believe that he was serious about affecting any change. And so, from X's perspective, he didn't believe that working within the system was going to net any tangible results. And so he was opposed to that. King was so confident. As a matter of fact, King had once said, after getting to know Johnson as he did, that he would never judge another person based on their political origins, because he found Johnson to be highly accommodating. They had some serious battles because the timeliness of the civil rights, some of the policies that Johnson had implemented were not necessarily the best of times, but
Right.
King pushed him anyway. And he found Johnson, in the end, amenable to twisting arms to get legislation passed. So King believed, contrary to X, that working within the system was making, and the '64 Voting Rights Act is what I'm thinking about.
Right.
And then the Civil Rights Act of 1965, which was the first time that that affirmative action came into being when Johnson signed it in, I believe, July.
Well, it's
No, it wasn't July. It was October. It was in July when he gave that famous speech Johnson did
Right.
at Howard University about the necessity for helping blacks get out of poverty.
What is fascinating, we're about out of time, but what is fascinating to me about this is that you have leaders like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. who are coming from radically different places, interacting in the same spheres, being influenced differently by religion, but that in the end, religion was one of the kind of motivating factors behind some of these movements as they incorporated it into their own life. Well, this is, I'd like to talk to you all day about this. Maybe when we get back to the office, we can continue our discussion. It's been fascinating, but we're out of time. That is Religion and Life for this week. And if you have questions, comments, or suggestions, please contact us at watchapptv.com. Until next time, I'm Ozzie Ostwalt. Thank you.